This right here is the Tanuki. It's a tiny 40% custom DIY keyboard. Now, why do you want to build one of these? Well, it's a fun DIY project, and thanks to JLCPCB for sponsoring today's video, I'm going to show you how you can build one of these yourself. Now, custom keyboards are nothing new, and they're kind of a hobby for some people and a money sink for others, but this cool little 40% keyboard is kind of special because while it is lacking a ton of the buttons you're probably going to see on everyday keyboards, because a spacebar is actually 2 function keys, you can actually use this thing for pretty much everything, even though it's a fraction of the size of a standard keyboard. So this isn't some random keyboard that you're buying off the shelf at Best Buy or Walmart. You're gonna have to build this yourself. So let's go over to the desk. I'll show you what you need to build it, and then we'll start assembly. The Tanuki keyboard was designed by Seth Senpai, and you can find a link to their GitHub page in the video description. There you can find the complete bill of materials, instructions, and files. So we'll start with the off-the-shelf items here. If you search for it on a website such as DigiKey or even Amazon for some of it, it'll come up. So there you have several different options for some of the components. I'll show you what I'm using here. So firstly, you're gonna need 42 diodes. You can either go with through-hole mounting ones or surface mounting ones. Through-hole is much easier to use, but I'll demo both. You're also gonna need some switches, of course. It is a keyboard. Now, pretty much any Cherry MX compatible switch will work, 3 or 5 pin. I am using Gateron Blues here. They were on sale on Amazon, and I do like clicky. You're gonna need one of these very small resistors. This is probably gonna be the most annoying thing to solder on, but if you take your time, you should be able to handle it just fine. You're gonna need a micro USB port, a reset button. The brains of the keyboard is going to be a Arduino Pro Micro, and you are going to need the headers for it as well. It's not a modern electronics project without RGBs, and we are using some neopixels for this. For some of the larger switches, we are going to be using a CoStar style stabilizer. And because spare switches are probably not too fun to type on, you are going to need some keycaps. So I went with some DSA styled ones. You can go with whatever you want. You can buy them or you can even print them. You're going to need some 3mm screws, and you're going to need a sacrificial USB micro cable. And the final 2 items you're going to need, you're not going to be able to buy these off the shelf. You're going to need the Tanuki custom PCB, and you're going to need a case for everything. Now, thanks to JLCPCB for sponsoring today's video, they hooked us up with both of these. I'm going to show you how you can source your own PCBs or even 3D prints. So let's head over to the computer and I'll show you how. Looking to get some custom PCBs or even a 3D print? JLCPCB can help you out. Getting your custom PCBs is as easy as creating an account, uploading your Gerber files, and selecting any options or specifications you want. We're gonna go with a black PCB to go for that stealth look. And with 3D printing options starting at $1, it's as easy as uploading your STL and selecting what material you want it to be printed out of. We're gonna go with SLS nylon for this case. And JLC PCB will even take the time to review your files to ensure everything is good to go with the method of 3D printing you choose. Check out JLC PCB in the link below for up to $54 in new user coupons. Thank you for sponsoring today's video. Now for tools, you are going to be doing a bunch of soldering. So my soldering iron of choice is a TS100. I power it with a 24-volt power supply. For solder, I do like using the 6337 rosin core solder. And anytime you're doing really any soldering, but especially surface mount components, some good flux is really handy to have, so you may want to grab some of that as well. And of course, don't forget your Allen keys. Now again, this is a custom keyboard and I'm building one of these for the first time, so if I forget something here, I'll call it out in the video. So that's everything you need. Let's go ahead and start putting this together. So for now, we're gonna be working on the back of the PCB. That's the side that says Tanuki Trash Panda 40% with a little Tanuki girl in the corner, I guess. It's actually handy. You're gonna be referencing this picture later. So the first thing we're gonna mount is our reset switch and that really tiny, annoying resistor. Anytime you are working with surface mount, a little bit of flux does help quite a bit, especially with these small components. And if you're wondering exactly where everything goes, there are some labels on the PCB itself, but if you look at the GitHub, there is pictures of everything and where they go. So now, as always, I will say this, anytime you're following a video guide for a project, it's always good to check the actual documentation, because once this video is online, it's a time capsule. So if things change, it's always good to reference the official documentation. Now, everyone kind of goes about soldering in their own way. It's one of those things that it's good to find what works for you, and if it works, just keep doing it. So for me, anytime I have something with multiple pads that I need to solder down, I usually will tin one of the pads, line up what I'm trying to solder down the one side. You need to realign it, just heat it back up, and then I'll go ahead and then solder the other pad. And this is where the flux really comes in handy. So there we go. We have our reset switch installed. Now, luckily, this is probably the hardest thing to solder on the build, and you're doing this right at the start. JLCPCB, when you order PCBs, they come in packs of 5. So if you're really worried, you do have extra PCBs, grab a few of these extra resistors just in case. Now, with these components, unlike later components, orientation doesn't really matter. So you just need to solder them in place. Doesn't matter which way they go. There we go. And with that, we're on our way to our custom keyboard. So next up, we have our diodes. Now, unlike these previous components, these actually have to go in a certain orientation. If you look at the diodes, there is a black line or a mark, usually denoting the cathode side. On the PCB, you can see where all the diodes go. They're marked with the D and then a number. There will be a circular pad and a square through-hole pad. The cathode goes towards the square through-hole pad, like so. Now with the surface mount diodes, it's a similar thing, only they have a little line marking the cathode side. They do mount in the same location, only they mount on the 2 inner surface mount pads, not the through-hole pads. So because I totally goofed and I didn't order enough of these very easy to install diodes, I'm going to be using both because I do have the surface mount diodes as well. So I'll install all these on video and then I'll show you how to install the surface mount ones if you're crazy and you want to use the harder option. Although I will say it is a little bit cleaner. So let's go ahead and get these installed. What I do for these is I'll put them through and then you solder them from the opposite side. So just something I'm going to point out now, the bottom row of diodes is opposite of every other row. So on every other row up here, the cathode points towards the bottom of the PCB. On the bottom row of diodes, they actually point upwards. So don't get complacent. And just because all of these were the same, you're going to assume these last row here are the same, because otherwise you're going to have a bad time. Always double check, never assume. Okay, give everything a quick once over just to make sure you got everything going the right way. It's a lot easier to fix now before you solder them on. So now we're going to flip it over. And as I was installing them, I was folding the pins over. This helps keep it nice and flush. You want to have these diodes as close to the PCB as possible. So bending the wires back as you install them makes it easier. And this way you can install them all first and then go and solder them all up at once. So now we're going to go ahead and solder all these on. This is 6337 rosin core solder. I find I really don't have to use flux on through holes too often. Can if you want. I don't think it's needed. So I find once it's done, folding them all back up, all the pins back up, just to make sure that you have everything soldered down. And we're gonna come to the first tool that I forgot to mention at the beginning, a pair of snips, because obviously you don't want this in your keyboard. So go ahead and trim off all the excess wire now. Oh, and by the way, make sure you're wearing safety glasses when doing this, because you don't want one of these flying into your eye. You do not want to cut these actually flush to the surface. You want to have a little bit up, and that's because if you do cut it like directly flush on the surface, you actually risk ripping the pad off and damaging the PCB. So just cut them right above the blob, basically. So that's how you mount the nice, easy to do through-hole diodes. Now I'm going to show you how to do the really annoying and small surface mount diodes. Now, you may want to use these if you're looking for like the cleanest build possible, because since these are surface mount, they are a cleaner package. However, they are small and they are very hard to read. So ensuring that you solder these on in the correct orientation is kind of a pain. And if you're like me and you suffer from something like essential tremors, where you're always you always have a slight shake to yourself, they're gonna be fun. So I'll show you one here and then I'll go through the rest. So, as always, flux is your friend. I'm gonna go ahead and tin up one pad. And again, same rule, cathode towards the square through-hole pin. I'm gonna get my diode here, make sure I have it orientated the right way. Line it up. Solder the one side down, and then do the other side. Done. So the advantage, again, of using surface mount, it is a cleaner package. It looks, and it is a little bit simpler. You don't have to do any trimming, but they are definitely a much bigger pain in the butt to do. So now we're moving on to, by and large, the most important component on this keyboard, the RGB. So we got neopixels here. We need to put 4 neopixels on here. And like the diodes, they do have an orientation. You can see there's a notched corner on them. There are 4 pads we have to solder down. And you're gonna orientate it so that that notch is actually facing towards the little Tanuki girl in the corner. You need to know there's 4 pads. Process is the same. I tin up one of the pads. Now be careful soldering on the neopixels. This is true to all the components, but especially the neopixels. They are actually a little susceptible to heat. So be careful soldering them. You don't want to accidentally cook them by overheating them with your soldering iron. So now we need to attach our micro USB connector here. Now you're going to notice there are 5 small pins and 2 large pins for soldering this onto the board. The 2 large pins are to stabilize it, and the 5 smaller pins are your data connection, power pins, ground, etc. Now this is some large pins here, so I am going to use some flux just to make sure everything's good. Now if you use flux and the PCB is of good quality and it's properly masked and everything, even soldering these small little pins shouldn't be too hard. Because the purpose of the mask, if you're wondering why PCBs are colored and what the color is, that's the mask basically. Normally it's green, but it prevents solder from sticking. So the brains of the keyboard is this Arduino Pro Micro here. And this solder's on right here, but first things first, we're gonna put the headers on. Now, solder the headers on. Do not solder this on yet, because we need to get at these 2 switches when we solder those on first. So if you solder this on right now, you're not gonna be able to solder your keys on. You're gonna have a bad time. Now remember, you're actually soldering these on the other side of the board. So it can be a little bit of a pain to keep everything lined up. So what you can do is you can use the Arduino itself to help line everything up. That way you don't have your pins going like that and you can't actually install the Arduino on later. Or what you can do, if you have a breadboard, you can install the pins into the breadboard, and that will keep everything lined up as you solder these pins on. Now, this is going to be your last chance to see some of these components before we solder things on in the next step. So you're really going to want to go through your board right now and make sure everything is good. Get a good light and go through and make sure all your diodes are orientated correctly. You don't have any cold solder joints. You didn't forget to solder anything. Make sure everything is good right now, because this is going to be the last time you're going to be able to fix some of these things easily. I think we're good. So now that we have everything clean, we're sure everything's good, we're gonna go ahead, drop the PCB into the case, and we are going to put some switches in now. So your switches install from the front. Now I've never done this before, and I don't really know if there's a proper way you're supposed to do this, but I'm going to install the corner ones first, solder those in, make sure everything's seated correctly, and I'm going to work my way inwards. And depending on which Arduino kit you used and where you sourced it from and what headers you use, you may need to trim short so that it doesn't interfere with the backplate. Now you may notice that the brains of your keyboard is here and the USB port to plug in the keyboard is here. So we're gonna have to connect the two. So you're gonna need a sacrificial USB cable, and essentially you're just gonna strip the 4 wires out of the cable and you're gonna solder them right here. So they're just gonna act like a jumper between the Arduino Micro and the external USB port. And if all is well, that is it for soldering. So you can put away your soldering iron, unless of course you goof something up, you're gonna have to fix it later. But now we can go ahead, plug this into the computer and get this thing programmed. So we need to go ahead and put some firmware on here, because right now if you plug this into your computer, you're just gonna get an LED on the Pro Micro and nothing's really gonna happen. So we're gonna use QMK as our keyboard firmware, and the installation of this is quite simple. So we'll go through that right now. We're gonna be using the default configuration for this keyboard. If you wanna go and change some of the key assignments up, you can go ahead and do that. I won't cover that in this tutorial though. So first thing you're gonna do is go to the Tanuki GitHub, and you're gonna want to download everything if you haven't already. Go to firmware, and all the links you're gonna need are here. So we're gonna be using QMK. Let's go to the QMK guide, and you're gonna want the QMK toolbox. So go ahead and download the latest release for your appropriate operating system. Once that's open up here, you're gonna wanna hit open. You're gonna wanna select the hex file for the firmware that we're gonna be installing. It's in the firmware folder. And you're gonna wanna make sure you have the correct ACMega selected. So it's a 32U4 if you're following the guide and using the components that I've been showing. Now, we're gonna go ahead and plug our keyboard into the computer. Now, once you plug it in, you should get a red LED turn on. However, as you can see here, it's not being detected. We need to put it in bootloader mode. So to put it in DFU or bootloader mode, you're gonna have to hit that reset button that you soldered on in that first step twice. And you'll see here, it'll pop up. It's now detected. You can hit flash. Now you do have to do this relatively quickly because it will exit DFU mode if you're not quick enough. So let it do its thing. It'll only take a couple seconds. And that's all it takes to install the default firmware for the Tanuki keyboard. If you want to change key assignments, you can do that. There's guides out there on how to do it. QMK is a quite common firmware for custom keyboards. So there's plenty of tutorials out there, but you'll know you did it right when you plug it in and your LEDs light up. Once you get the firmware flash, there are keyboard checkers that you can use. Most of them are web-based, but you're gonna wanna make sure that all the keys that you've installed are actually working and the button that they're supposed to be is popping up. So just use an online keyboard checker and make sure everything is good before we move on to the final step. So since we have split space key here and they are a little bit larger than the other keys, you may want to put stabilizers on it. So they do use the CoStar style stabilizer here, which they're not too complicated of a system to install. And there you have it. Now from the front, it looks done. However, we can't be having this. This is not acceptable. And you know what? We got these RGBs here. They need to glow. So let's go ahead and get ourselves a backplate made up. So when you have a little keyboard like this, why not pair it up with a little battle station? Got ourselves a wireless mouse here, Big Tree Tech Pad 5. This has a Raspberry Pi CM4, and just for fun, the entire thing is running off of a battery bank. So let's play some Quake. But before we do, again, this is a split level keyboard. That means your space buttons are also function buttons. We don't want to be hitting F1 while trying to circle strafe and jumping at the same time. So let's put it in game mode. And this way, the space buttons are just regular space buttons. Have I mentioned I've never actually played Quake before? So there you have it. This is the Tanuki, and this can open the door to a lot of fun projects. Not only does this involve 3D printing, it also involves electronics, soldering, a little bit of firmware customization if that's your thing, and custom keyboards are their own hobby in of itself. So if you found this video interesting, make sure you like that smash button. If you want to see more like this, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. If you want to help support the content I create and the things I do, links in the description as well. Again, shout out to JLCPCB for sponsoring today's video. Cheers.